My name is Father Bill Sheehan, and I'm an Oblate of Mary Immaculate and part of Contemplative Outreach of Boston. And on behalf of Contemplative Outreach of Boston, we want to welcome you all to this wonderful day in which we are going to focus on the contemplative vision of the mystics. And it is my pleasure to introduce Father Ron Rollheiser, also an Oblate of Mary Immaculate, and presently the president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. Ron, as you know, is the author of several books on spirituality, his most recent being God's Great Act of Fidelity, Waiting for Christ in the Eucharist, published in 2011. Others of note are A Shattered Lantern, Restless Heart, and Holy Longing. Ron also is very, very steeped in the mystical teaching of St. Teresa of Lisieux and John of the Cross. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ron, a brother oblate, a very good friend, and a wise teacher. Now, in total transparency, the only negative I would suggest regarding Father Ron is that he rooted for the Washington Nationals last night. But like all of those in contemplative outreach, we just choose to let it go. Welcome, Ron.
I have to get this other microphone going here. So, you're the only group I've ever spoken to are ahead of schedule. Okay, Kenny, we're on? Okay. So good morning, everyone. And the first question is, everybody has good sound? You can all hear? Okay. I want to thank Bill for that introduction, but I want to thank you especially for inviting me here. It's always a privilege to speak to a group like this, and it's always a little humbling. I notice we're a very diverse group in terms of different religious orders and lay people and stuff who are here. Just a little story on that one. I'm not sure why this happens, although it's flattering to me, but people often get me mixed up with Richard Rohr. And I mean quite seriously, in fact, when Paulus published Crossroads, when they published The Shattered Lantern the first time, they got it wrong. On the back cover, they had written Richard Rollheiser, OFM, okay? And so one day I was being introduced in Seattle at a talk, and the woman had the book, and she said, now the Crossroads says Richard Rollheiser, OFM. She said, now you obviously realize that's wrong. He said, his name is Ronald, and he's a Carmelite. Okay. So, although a little more humorous of an introduction, one time I was being introduced by a priest, and he had trouble pronouncing my name. So he asked me 2 or 3 times, like, how do you say my name? And I'd say, Rollheiser. I said, look, if you get mixed up, it's like the beer. Just say Budweiser. It's close enough. So he went up and read off this list of credentials. It said, so here is Father Miller. Okay. Okay. And he was quite serious. Okay. Okay, our topic for this morning, Thérèse of Lisieux. And I've chosen, there's many ways you can go on Thérèse, and rather than focus on her little way and so on, I want to try to lead into Thérèse through, as the title says, through the intrigue that the world has always had with Thérèse of Lisieux, which continues. Our perennial intrigue with Thérèse of Lisieux. And I think you have in your folders and so on a little handout of page on each side, which will give it kind of a little PowerPoint so you can follow where I should be going with this talk. Okay. And I want to enter and talk about and eventually get to what her real depth is. But I want to do it by getting there by walking through why she's so popular and why she has so much intrigued the world, and not just the secular world, the world. a few years ago, they took her remains around North America. I was living in Edmonton at the time, and they brought her remains to the biggest church in Edmonton, which is actually called St. Therese. And for 3 days and 3 nights, people just filed through there. It was like the Pope's death or something. Rock stars only get a couple of hours. Okay. She got 3 days. Why this stunning popularity? There have been younger saints, more austere saints, kinder saints, more heroic saints. But in recent years, there have been no more popular saints than Therese of Lisieux. And also her popularity is it's unique that it goes across many lines, so that there is, and we can talk about that, a cult of popularity at a popular level, which isn't always healthy. We can talk about that. I think sometimes that cult of popularity encrusts her in a piety that you take away the real depth of Therese of Lisieux. But just a stunning popularity at a kind of a very romantic, pious level. But she's also intrigued great intellectuals, and not just faith intellectuals, atheists. Great theologians have written books on her and pondered her. So she has this wide range, because she has a capacity, and we'll talk about that, to touch and stir our religious imagination, but also to stir our romantic imagination. And when you put those two together, it creates a great fire, the religious imagination, the romantic imagination. Now, on your sheet, I want to give you the overture at an opera. I want to give you the thesis in miniature, and then we're going to unpackage it. Why is she so popular? For 3 interpenetrating reasons. The first one is that she is the Anne Frank of the spiritual life, and we'll look at that. And so that, and some of her strength and much of her, the false piety around her comes out of this, so that she's the child mystic, and that'll always have powerful romantic stirrings. So in many ways, she's to the spiritual life what Anne Frank is to literature. Secondly, she is a woman, and I want to use the word woman rather than child. She's a woman of extraordinary complexity, and I'll try to unpackage that for you. And oftentimes, we get this implicitly, that we don't, say, I'm going to read Therese of Lisieux because she's so extraordinarily complex as a woman, not just particularly as a theologian. She's just an extraordinarily complex person, and you're going to see, and that's a sign, you see that in many great people. And then lastly, and most important of all, is that, and this is the real power, that's what we want to work to. This is the real gift of Therese of Lisieux to the world and to spirituality and to contemplative prayer. And that is that Therese of Lisieux has the power to touch that previously touched part of us. Sounds like a contradiction. Sounds like she can touch that untouched part of you. No. Therese of Lisieux can touch that previously touched part. You're going to see that's her real depth. We want to work to that. And usually we get hung up on the first 2, and we don't realize really what the deep part is. And we kind of get the deep part through the first 2. Now, if you're sufficiently confused, we can start. Okay. The Anne Frank of the spiritual life. Henry Nouwen, once, and I very much like the way he coined this. Henry Nouwen once said, if you want to understand the Second World War, you can read 200 books on history, and you can watch thousands of hours of documentary film, or you can read the life of Anne Frank. And if you read the life of Anne Frank, the diary of a 13-year-old girl, you will get an inner sense of the real tragedy of war and what it does to people and how it destroys what's precious inside of humanity and inside of us. Now, he said you can read 200 books, watch documentary films, or you can enter through the soul of one person. You read the diary of Anne Frank, and you get a sense. This is the real tragedy of the Second World War. Well, it's the same with the spiritual life. You can read hundreds of books on prayer, on theology, on spirituality, to get some sense of how is the human soul, how is it precious, and how is it meant to be attuned to God and to life here. You can read hundreds of books and go to a lot of workshops, or you can read The Story of a Soul by Thérèse of Lisieux. And in many ways, like Anne Frank, she was very young, and so through the prism of a young woman who at that stage has an extraordinary innocence, inside of her. So it's like drinking from a pure stream, and you see how a soul is meant to be attuned to God and to know its own preciousness, to know its own love, and so on. She words that, and she gives us just a wonderful, wonderful, unique, and precious expression of that. So that, reading her is like reading a few hundred books. Now, it's interesting, with the Diary of Anne Frank and The Story of a Soul. So as you know, Thérèse of Lisieux didn't write a lot of stuff. Basically, she wrote this one book, which isn't a very thick book, and was a couple of manuscripts that they put together and so on. Now, there's a lot written about her, and actually her sisters kept diaries of her deathbed conversations, which constitute 2 big volumes, but her own writings are just this slim little diary. And as you know, it was written, her older sister Pauline was the abbess at the convent, and when Thérèse was diagnosed, and she knew she was going to die in about a year, her sister asked her to write this memoir for the family. This was meant to be kind of a private little diary for the family. And after she died, and she wrote this while she was sick, the Carmelite nuns, I don't know if they still do it, but at the time when one of their members died, they'd send around a little flyer of a couple of pages, to their other convents. Sister Martha died, and she was born here, and a few little, personal things about her. Well, what the Carmelites did when Thérèse of Lisieux died, they simply sent this around to the other convents, and some publishers got a hold of this, and within some years, they couldn't keep the printing presses in France printing day and night fast enough for the demand for this diary. Okay? But now, I want to say something about both Anne Frank and Thérèse of Lisieux. Millions of young girls write diaries. Millions of young boys write diaries. And oftentimes, they're not interesting to anybody other than themselves and their mother. And today, I guess, for a page on Facebook. Okay. For both of them, their diaries are unique. Why does, for instance, the Diary of Anne Frank and The Story of a Soul by Thérèse of Lisieux stand out that much? Well, first of all, there's just a little more depth. I think in Thérèse, a lot more depth. No offense to Anne Frank. But what needs to be said is they were also both great artists. These books aren't just books of depth. They're also works of art. These were both, they are gifted, natural, great artistic writers. Neither of them who had much education. I'll talk about it later about Thérèse. But they're both consummate works of art. You can't write like that unless you are the same as nobody can compose like Mozart unless you're as gifted as Mozart. So it's the first thing I want to say about Anne Frank and Thérèse of Lisieux. She was a gifted, natural artist. And so her writing, it's not just that there's depth in there. There is depth. But it's also a great piece of art. And that works in us subtly when you're reading it. So you're reading it, and there's real depth in this book. But at the same time, this is a piece of art. And great art cuts deeply. The same as the Diary of Anne Frank. You don't have to be that sympathetic to her or her family, but we are. But independent of whether this was written in war or whatever, this is just an exceptional piece of literature. The same with Thérèse of Lisieux. Her diary, The Story of a Soul, like the Diary of Anne Frank, is an exceptional piece of literature. You just can't write like that. And it's interesting, she probably had about a grade 7 education, and even that was partly homeschooled and not very consistent. She couldn't spell very well and so on. It didn't matter. She was just a very, very gifted writer. And see, so that is part of, that's the initial intrigue. You have this young child, and she likes to portray herself as a young child, but well, look, she's much more complex than that. You know, but she plays that role, and she'll always use the Tinkerbell persona. She's gonna, it's not the only one she uses, but she uses it, and that oftentimes that's what we get intrigued. You know, the young girl who lost her mother, you know, lost her sisters to the convent, and she writes this beautiful diary and so on. Well, that's true, but this is a great work of literature. Just one, you know, red flag at this stage. See, those kinds of diaries have the ability to inflame our romantic imagination. And that's good, and it can be very good, because that's what can make you fall in love. But it can also be bad, because from that you can also get all kinds of over-sentimentality and piety and so on, which can block you from the major depth of the person. I was talking to somebody at the door this morning who's going to Lisieux, and I've been there a number of times, and I very much like Lisieux. It's a very unspoiled place, except for one place, which is actually the basilica built to Therese. I'm not sure Therese would be that comfortable in that basilica. It's a beautiful basilica, but I remember going in to have a sound and light show at night. And of all the things that I didn't like in Lisieux, that one was the most, because it was like drinking sugar, is maybe about the way of putting it. And they had all these images of this young girl crying, "Mama, my mother is lost," and so on. I'm not sure that's what you want to get from Therese of Lisieux. It was true of her life, and we'll look at that. But that's not her. And see, so some of the piety that's developed around her, and even the expression, the little flower, I think has worked to put more people off her than have, and maybe not connected us to her in the right way. But that's there, and it's powerful. I think it's the first entry point for so many people. She is this young Anne Frank. You know, Anne Frank dies during the Second World War, writes this powerful romantic diary. Therese of Lisieux dies at 24 and writes this powerful romantic diary. And the fact that she was a strikingly beautiful child and woman helps too. You know, so that just this image of just this beautiful, beautiful child who's so deep and so spiritual and so innocent and loses her mother, actually loses about 4 mothers, as we'll see, it overpowers with, it inflames the romanticism inside of us. And that's the first level of intrigue, and it's a valid level, but it's far and away not what this gal was about, or this woman. Okay, secondly, more importantly, her depth and appeal comes in the fact that she was, and we pick this up unconsciously until you begin to pick it up consciously. She was a woman of extraordinary complexity. The same as a lot of great people are people of extraordinary complexity. You can be with Jesus. Jesus was not simple. We like to make Jesus out this simple shepherd. No, you know. You read the Gospels, and the reason why there's 200 kinds of Christianity is because Christ was able to hold such incredible polar opposites together in ways that we can't. And Therese was like that. St. Augustine was like that. Aristotle was like that. Teilhard de Chardin was like that. These are people who, they're almost a contradiction, but they're not. They can hold together such incredible polar opposites. Give you an example. If you read Teilhard de Chardin, and that's also going to be true of Therese of Lisieux. So you read his and he'll have a number of times in his diary, but in his wonderful, his spiritual book, The Divine Milieu. And earlier on in the book, he says this. He says, you know, he said, I was born with 2 incurable loves inside of me. Said I was born, he said, and I was born, he says, and I have an incurable love for everything that's pagan. He said, I just love the earth. and the earthiness and the beauty and the beauty of creation and just the feel of materiality. He said, and I can never deny that. He says, I'm in love with this planet, and I'm in love with material, with the physical. He said, at the same time, he said, I was born with an incurable love and sense of God, and I can never deny that. He said, and this has made my life complex. This afternoon, we'll look at Ruth Burroughs. You know, the first line of her autobiography, she says, I was born with a tortured complexity, and that is why my life has not been easy. That's also true of Thérèse of Lisieux. At times you see in her a tortured complexity, which is going to signal some of her depth. Let's look at that. What is her tortured complexity? First of all, which probably sets her consciousness. She is what I call the ultimate doted on child who has the ultimate tragic childhood. She's a very unique, and the two together, as I'll try to say, help create the great depth inside of her. On the one hand, and I don't mean doted on in the bad sense, Thérèse of Lisieux was loved as a child in a way that the rest of us can only envy. Her mother was a saint, her dad was a saint, her sisters were saints, her aunt was a saint, and she was and they're not kidding, they're all up for canonization. You know, she didn't exactly grow up in an abusive home, you know. Like her mother and dad are going to be canonized, her sister are going to be canonized, her aunt and uncle who tried to take care of her, they're going to be canonized and so on. And she was the youngest in a big family, and she was this beautiful child who was never colicky, and just from the womb, she was and everybody just loved her. And she was loved deeply, and it's interesting, as I say, you know, you can't love somebody too much. And love doesn't spoil somebody. When love is wrong, it spoils somebody. She was loved purely, and it didn't spoil her, and the opposite. So she was she was just showered with love. And this is going to be a very, very important part of her spirituality. She says, later on, she says, knowing that God loved me this much, my parents and my family loved me this much, I knew I was loved by God that much. Most of us struggle the opposite. We haven't experienced a lot of real unconditional love in our lives, or maybe never have at all. We haven't been valued. It's really hard for us to believe that God values us. How do I believe that I'm really precious in God's eyes when I've never experienced that humanly? See, she experienced just how preciously she was valued and loved by her family, her sisters, and her community. And then she realized, I'm this precious and loved by God. So she really drew a long straw. She was a very, very loved child, and in many ways doted on as a child. And, you know, telling Thérèse, you're precious, you're this wonderful, wonderful child, and she was, okay? Now, at the same time, she almost died of clinical depression at age 9. So her childhood, which was marked with all this powerful love, was also marked with powerful tragedy right from the time of conception. So her mother conceived her, but her mother already had breast cancer. And so when Thérèse was born, her mother couldn't nurse her. So she was taken from her mother and given to a wet nurse who happened to also be a wonderful woman who loved this child for the first 18 months of her life and nursed her. And so she bonded strongly to this woman, but then at 18 months she was given back to her mother. And there was already a first severance. She lost the mother at 18 months, the only one she knew. Then she bonded strongly to her mother, who was a saint, but then 3.5 years later, her mother died. So now she's lost her second mother, and then she links very strongly to her sister Pauline, who's 16, but a year later, Pauline goes to the convent and she loses her. So here, she's 9 years old by then, and she's lost 3 mothers. And so what happens is, the first time they visit her sister in the Carmel, and she's the 9-year-old girl, and her dad bought her a new dress for the occasion, and she's pretty happy. She's going to see her sister, and she's got a new dress. And you got to picture the 9-year-old, and this can get into people's romantic imagination. And so they come there, and of course, the first 5 minutes are about her and her Pauline kissing her, and you're so wonderful. But afterwards, the adults get into some adult talk. And, as kids, pretty soon you're not the center of attention anymore. And they said at one point she goes, and she writes this up later, said, I went in front of Pauline, I showed her, said, can't you see I have a new dress? And she began to cry. They took her home, and she hyperventilated, and she went into depression. They called in doctors, and she almost died. And it wasn't just the incident. Obviously, she was, there was a long decline, and she went into a clinical depression from which she almost died. See, so that's the first contrast. You have this wonderfully loved child who has suffered all these losses in her life, who at the same time is dealing with deep, deep tragedy. And you're going to always see both in her writing. When you look at her writing, the story of a soul, you'll always see very clearly both of those streams. So I'm this loved child, it's wonderful, family, and so on. At the same time, right from age 7, 8, 9, she has a deep and an abiding sense of tragedy, of death, of heaviness. One of her teachers told a story. She said when Therese was 7, and she was attending this school. It was a boarding school, but she went there as a day student with her sisters. And even there, she was such a sensitive child that after a while she couldn't go there anymore. And it was Thursday. And even to this very day in Europe, Thursday afternoons are free. There's no school, there's no business. It's like our Saturday afternoons. And so the girls were all out playing, and the teacher came into the room, and here's young Therese sitting by herself. The teacher said, aren't you out playing? She says, no, I don't want to play today. And she was just staring. And the teacher said, what are you doing? She says, well, I'm thinking. And the teacher said, what are you thinking about? She said, well, I think about death and God and things like that. She said, I think. Okay. This is a 7-year-old, not a normal 7-year-old. Now, when you put those two together, great love, great tragedy, it makes for great depth. There was an article in Time magazine probably 10, 15 years ago, and I wish I'd kept it. It was an article on the human brain and how the human brain functions and so on. One of these popular articles, but with quite a bit of research to it. And they asked this question. You've all heard this. You've all heard how we only use about 10% of our brain cells, biochemically. We just simply, about 90% of our brain cells go unused. And so we always think to ourselves, if I could get into that other 90%, you could be the new Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and so on and combined, And so how do we get into that other 90%? Well, the article said this. They said, first of all, they said, we don't get into it because we don't need it. You can be Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg with 10% of your brain cells. You don't need them, okay? Secondly, he said, it's really hard to get into there. What happens, he said, and these aren't cells for pragmatics, for analytics, they're cells for depth. And they said it's really hard to get there. And they used this image almost like static lock on the old rechargeable batteries. You're only using this much, and after all, that's all the way the battery charges. We're just 10% of our brain. But they said you get there in one of two ways, two different ways. They said, what drives into the deep part of your brain? They said, it's particularly when you're young. They say when you're very young, the experience of great love. They say a mother tickling a baby and making the baby laugh and so on, you're actually firing the synapses of their brain cells. Great love gets you there, and great tragedy. Deep love and deep pain get you to depth. Now you take Therese. As a young child, she had both of them in an extraordinary quantity and quality. She had deep love and deep tragedy. It's no accident that at 15, 16, and 17, she was a doctor of the soul. And so, and you sense that in her writings. You can analyze it and pick it up. Usually we just get that unconsciously. So people are reading and say, well, there's this little kid, but she's not a little kid, and you flip back and forth. Okay, secondly, she's always the archetypal puella. Puella is the, Tinkerbell. Puella is the Latin word for the little girl, for a little girl, but it also means in anthropology, the little girl who never grows up. That's Tinkerbell. Or the Pooh-Air. The Pooh-Air is a boy, but that's Peter Pan. They never grow up, and at the same time, she's Sophia, the crone, the wise, white-haired old woman. There's an incredible intrigue when you read Thérèse of Lisieux. You know, she always played, on one side, this Tinkerbell role. So, you know, this is part of her own self-defined persona. You know, I'm the little girl. I'm God's little plaything. She always signed to Petite Thérèse. I'm just this little girl. And all her letters, she'd sign the letters off with this beautiful little slogan, I kiss you with my whole heart. And so she always had this thing, I'm a little girl, I'm blowing kisses to the wind, and all these grown-ups are around here. She always remained Tinkerbell, and yet at the same time, she was always Sophia. She was a white-haired old woman sitting by the wisdom well, and she could deal out real, strong spiritual medicine. You know, some of her lines are, and that's why she's been named a doctor of the soul. She'll play the Tinkerbell, and I miss my family and my sisters and this and that and so on. There's much more to her. Just some lines that come to mind that, you know, I keep in my head as kind of sound bites to keep me straight. She'll tell you, she says, be careful not to seek yourself in a relationship because you'll end up with a broken heart that way. That's not Tinkerbell speaking, that's Sophia. Be careful. Don't seek yourself in a relationship because you'll end up with a broken heart that way. Or she says, there's a lot of people interested in prayer. There's very few people interested in God. We're interested in praying. We're not interested in God. And I can just spin these off. She was a true doctor of the soul. And at the same time, always played that, and so you can see the intrigue. Piety often picks up that Tinkerbell, the poor, innocent little girl who lost her mother. And she massaged that. Okay. And wisdom picks up Sophia. At the other side sits a white-haired old woman. She was a young girl with an old soul. And the two together make for a wonderful and intriguing combination. Thirdly, she was always, pardon me, the third is here. She was always the peasant and she was always the artist. Again, makes for her intrigue. So Thérèse of Lisieux had very little formal education, and she had very little life experience. She was born and raised in Lisieux, which is a small town, still a small town today, and other than one trip she took to Rome with her dad and her sisters, she never left this small town, and she moved to a convent about a mile away from her home, or less than a mile away. That was the extent of her life experience. And she had little formal education, and so in some sense she's the uneducated, non-life experience, and at the same time she was the natural artist who in her intuition knows the world and knows the soul. So she has the simplicity of the peasant, she has the complexity of the artist. And artists are always complicated. You don't have simple artists. You don't. And oftentimes they're more complicated than that they themselves can deal with, you know. And you're going to see it comes out in deep restlessness and a kind of a sense of the world and so on, even as she's never seen the world or never been out in the world. Okay, fourthly, she's the martyr who's detached from the world, but who has an excessive love for her family and the beauty of the world. Again, that contradiction, like Théodore de Chardin. She also, on the one hand, she was this very detached person who could look at life and really see life through the prism of Christ's vision of the Paschal mystery. You know, every day she'd pray, you know, like, take up your cross, leave the world behind. Those who seek their life will lose it. Those who give up their life will find it. I can let go of this world. When she first was diagnosed with tuberculosis and realized she'd die in a year, she was happy about that. You know, now I'm going to die. It's going to be wonderful, and so on. Wasn't so happy as she got closer to it, and so on. Okay, and yet at the same time, she never radiated, which is very important for those of you who work with spiritual direction, and never confused depression with sanctity. You know, There are people who seem to be detached. You know, they can give up the world, this doesn't mean anything. I was going to say most of the time. A good number of times that isn't sanctity at all. It's called depression, and should be named for what it is. You know, remember a few years ago when I was still working in seminary formation, we had a young man in our community, 24 years old, and on the surface, you would think you could order him from a catalog to be a religious. He was 24, he was very bright, very interested in theology, good marks, worked with the poor, had a very strong instinct for asceticism, so he moved his bed out of his room, so he slept on a little mat on the floor to be more in touch with the poor. He didn't seem to have the same needs as the other seminarians. He wouldn't drink beer with them, otherwise to be polite sometimes. So he was either in chapel praying, or he was studying, or he was trying to work with the poor. And on the surface, he looked like Francis of Assisi, except, he literally took the oxygen out of a room. You know, and walk in a room, seminarians took turns sitting beside him at a table trying to be polite to him, you know. He did everything right, but everything about him was wrong, you know. Eventually our superiors sent him to a counselor, a clinical counselor, and he said, you're in clinical depression, you need to leave the seminary, you need to get some professional help, which he did. Today he's a married man with kids and he's full of life, you know. See, sometimes detachment, it can look like detachment, but it's depression. With Therese of Lisieux, it's never depression, never, because it's balanced off by an excessive love of the world. In fact, she loved her family as much. If she didn't get a letter from them every day, she'd go into a sulk. That's not a very detached person. And yet, I can die, it's okay. See, again, this incredible complexity, a little like Teilhard. I'm born with an incurable love of the world, and I'm born with an incurable love of God. And she loved beauty, nature, flowers on her desk all the time. She loved the physical, the natural, her family. She loved humanity, and at the same time, she had this great detachment. And then, fifthly, she was a congenital loner who was ultimately able to embrace the world. You know, they've done studies on her on this, and it's very interesting. Excuse me. That, in fact, Ruth Burroughs, we'll talk about this afternoon, is a Carmelite, and Ruth Burroughs did a photographic study of Therese of Lisieux. And we have hundreds and hundreds of pictures of her because her sister Celine, who later entered the convent, was a photographer. So they did all these pictures of her. And Ruth did a photographic study of her and said, there's something very interesting about it. And after you hear this, if you look at the pictures, you'll see it. It says, Therese of Lisieux, in every group picture, and there's hundreds of group pictures, she's with other sisters, she's always deeply alone. Look at her in a picture. She's on the picture with a group, but she's alone. Like sometimes you get a picture of a team or cheerleaders, and they're all waving. They're together. She's on the picture. She's with the community, but she's with the community, but she's not with the community. She was a loner. There was something deeply alone about Therese of Lisieux, and yet at the same time, she's the patroness of missions, and for a good reason. You know, incidentally, I want to get a little oblate plug in here. It was the Oblates of Mary Immaculate who first began to push Rome for that. And it was our missionaries, French missionaries in northern Canada, who had this great devotion to Therese and were fired by her charism, who started putting pressure on bishops, and eventually Rome named her the patrons of missions. So here's a woman who never left Lisieux and died at age 24, who's the patroness of going around the world. Because at the same time as she was this loner, and this is the great paradox, never really left Lisieux, at the same time she had a heart that somehow connected to the world. And the world knew it, so as soon as they found out about her, everybody flocks to Lisieux, and everybody, it's part of her popularity. But again, this great paradox. And again, those two things are in her writings. Her writings are powerfully communitarian, even as they're the writings of somebody who's deeply alone. And then lastly, she was the restless, driven spirit who as a saint could will the one thing. Let's start backwards on this. Søren Kierkegaard, the great Lutheran theologian, gave us this definition, and he said, to be a saint is to be able to will the one thing. It's a good definition. Notice he doesn't say it's to be able to will one thing. He said it's to be able to will the one thing, God. Or in Mother Teresa's case, God and the poor. Okay? Now, that sounds like a simple definition. If to be a saint is to will the one thing, why aren't we all saints? All of us in this room, we want to will God, so why aren't we saints? Well, this is the difficulty. We want to will everything else as well. Henry Nouwen, who was this wonderful spiritual writer, and he'd use his own life to give this great expression to it. And Henry Nouwen used to be so honest in his diaries. So he'd write, for instance, he said, I want to be a great saint, but I also want to experience all the sensations that sinners experience. He said, I want to have a deep life of prayer, but I don't want to miss anything on television. Okay. I want to have a radical life for the poor, but I also want to travel and have a computer and go all over. He said, no wonder my life is strange. See, I want the right things, but I want all the other things too. See, a restless spirit. Therese had that. See, Therese, she had the temperament of the artist. She had the heart of the lover. She wanted to make love to the planet. She was a restless, driven spirit, but who was able to will the one thing, God. And again, that's in her writings, that's implicit, but it's very, very powerful. One of the reasons why her writings appeal to such and have that great depth is because this isn't a little girl of simple needs. This is Sophia, a woman of complicated needs. She could have written it, had she lived longer and written her autobiography when Ruth Burroughs wrote hers, she might have started her autobiography the way Ruth Burroughs does. In fact, that's how I first read Ruth Burroughs. I was walking in a bookstore, and I picked up a book, and the first line of the book says, I was born with a tortured complexity, and because of that, my life has been difficult. I thought, I want to read about this woman. Okay, that's also Therese of Lisieux. She was a woman who was very, very complex, a restless, driven, artistic spirit, but who could become a saint, who could discipline that. Notice the word discipleship comes from the word discipline. She could put that under this powerful discipline and channel it to make this powerful creative energy for the planet. That's where she's different than the little child, mystic, and so on. This woman is a woman of extraordinary complexity, and it's one of the reasons why her writings are so intriguing. It's also one of the reasons why their writings are so deep. She was a deep woman. She was Tinkerbell. She liked to play that role, but she also made clear that she is also Sophia, and you better listen to Sophia. Pat Tinkerbell on the head, watch her skipping, and say, you're marvelous little Therese, and then sit down and let Sophia give you a lesson. Okay, now, that's what's on the externals. That's what we pick up, but that's not her real power. Okay, there's also many complex women and so on, and they don't necessarily become saints, and they don't necessarily mentor our souls in this way. Why does she mentor our soul so deeply? Why is she a doctor of the soul? Well, this is the third part. It's her real power, her attunement to the preciousness of the human soul before God, and her capacity to touch that previously touched part within us. Her attunement to the preciousness of the soul, and then her capacity to touch that previously touched part. Let's work backwards on this so I don't think I'm following my outline. What is the previously touched part in us? Okay. Well, if I asked you this question, what is the deepest part of your heart or soul or person? Okay. Well, usually, we don't have a word for it. We call it our conscience. I don't particularly like that word because it's already got too much baggage as simply one part of us. It tells you what's right or wrong. No. There's something deeper. Let me start epistemologically. We use that expression where someone says, this rings true. You know what I mean, that expression? Have you ever asked yourself, what does it ring true to? Do you have a little bell inside of you, a little gong? Well, in fact, we do. Okay. It rings true to what? Well, it rings true to that previously touched part of you. As Ruth Burroughs would say, that's our mystical center. What is our deepest center? You have a wonderful psychiatrist or psychologist here at Harvard called Robert Coles, and he calls that our moral center. And Coles says the deepest loneliness we experience isn't physical or psychological or even sexual. Our deepest loneliness is moral. That's where you're searching for your soul mate. You know how today, it's a powerful question. Everybody wants, it's so hard to find your soul mate, which means somebody who meets your soul at that part. But what is that part? Okay. Well, I want to give you some images. I'll start with Henry Nouwen, who used to teach here at Yale. Henry Nouwen has a concept he called first love. Okay. What is first love? Well, Henry Nouwen said it's not the first time you fell in love. That's second love. He says first love is this. He said it's the unconscious, dark memory of once having been loved by God before you were born. Get this? You were once loved by God before you were born. And we don't have a conscious memory of that. We have a dark, mystical sense of that. You're going to see that is the center of what mystics call the center of mysticism. That we don't think it, we can't articulate it, we can't even feel it, we just know it. So that when you come into this world, you don't have to be taught what love is, you don't have to be taught what beauty is, you don't have to be taught what goodness is or what truth is. You already know them because they've been stamped inside of you. Bernard Lonergan, the great intellectual, Lonergan said, he calls this the brand of the first principles inside the human soul. What a wonderful expression. You know, you brand a cow. Okay. He says, we're born and God has branded divinity into us. We call it the image and likeness of God. God has branded divinity. But what is divinity? Sorry. Sorry, that's just a little congestion. Which is allergies. I live in Texas where there's so many trees and stuff that it takes you days to get... I'm sure Boston is clean. Okay. But you know, if you ever study, what are the transcendental properties of God? Well, oneness, goodness, truth, and beauty. And Lonergan says, you're born, they're stamped inside of you. Nobody has to teach you what love is. The first time you meet it, you're already evaluating it because you've known perfect love. Nobody has to tell you what beauty is. The first time you meet it, you know it. You evaluate all the beauty in your life against what? Against the bell. It's already inside of you. You've already experienced perfect beauty, perfect love, perfect doing this inside of God who made your soul. Okay? The mystics and the ancients, the mythologists, I love their image best of all. They call that the kiss of God inside of you. They say the last thing God does to a soul before God puts the soul in the body is God kisses the soul, and then during your whole life you unconsciously remember the kiss. So that when you receive your first kiss, you evaluate it against the perfect kiss. The first time you see beauty, you evaluate it against perfect beauty. First love, it's already been inside of you. See, you've already been touched. Nouwen says we have a deep unconscious memory of once having been handled and caressed by hands much gentler than we've met in this life. See, you've already been touched. You've already been branded. You've already been kissed. You've already been loved, and so on. And see, that's the deepest center part of our soul. Okay, that is our moral center. That is, it's at that place where all that's most precious to us lives, and our real lives. That's the place where we're looking for our soulmate. That's also the place of our deepest loneliness. Cole says much more than we're longing for somebody to sleep with physically or sexually, we're longing for somebody to sleep with morally. Looking for your soulmate. Who can touch you there? Who can meet you at that place? Now, that's Therese. See, Therese had been so wonderfully loved as a child, and then had also been deeply touched tragedy at her insides. So, as she writes, it's always right around that center. and she's putting in touch with that center inside of you. And just experience in different ways. You know what happens when you read Therese of Lisieux, and I've reread this book many times. Each time it calls you back to who you are. You want to be a better person, quite simply. You want to evaluate yourself and others in a whole different way. And sometimes, I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I had a very close friend of mine who was my age, dying of cancer. And he wasn't particularly religious, but he was trying to do this right. And he said, "You're a priest." He said, "Bring me some books. And I brought him different kinds of books. At the end, he said, "There's only one book I can still read." He said, and that's Therese of Lisieux. He said, "I can't even read the Bible anymore." He said, "But she keeps me in touch. Keeps me grounded about what's happening." See, Therese always brings us to this place, okay? And that's her real depth. She touches the previously touched part in us and attunes us to our own preciousness, which, she was lucky enough as a person to experience that from other people. Most of us in this room have not had that experience in a pure enough way, or even in any kind of way sometimes, from those around us. That I used to do a lot of work with Robert Moore, and wonderful man, and he always says, when he works with groups, he says, go back in your life and just ask yourself, try to name those times where somebody loved you without an angle, just blessed you and valued you and affirmed you for who you are, with just absolutely no strings attached at all. A lot of people get tears in their eyes. Never happened. Never happened. Maybe with your mother, maybe with your grandmother, maybe if you were very lucky in your marriage, or maybe with your own child or whatever. But a lot of people, no, or just kind of, we get tears in our eyes. Haven't had much of an experience of unconditional love. Therese did. But because of that, she was able to name that center and show us our preciousness. You can come to that through its opposite. And I want to say in a few minutes, that's also it lies at the deep root of her little way, which I'm convinced is, not that we misunderstand it, we just don't understand it, and we slice off parts which are valid, but we don't get her little way. You understand it by its opposite. Therese of Lisieux is the opposite of an abused child. See, when somebody's abused, or when somebody's, and there's positive abuse, but there's also simply the abuse of indifference, of never having been loved, Many of us weren't abused, we were simply never valued, Go away, don't show that the garbage, grow up, if you could play back your life as a film, the countless times as a child, where you were excited and you were filled with enthusiasm in life, and you came up to a significant adult, a parent, a teacher, a priest, whoever, and your enthusiasm was met with a bored, irritated, indifferent, throw it away, it's a piece of garbage, grow up, and see, we're not valued, okay? Or people who are positively abused, we're saying, your life and your meaning isn't as important as my pleasure for just this moment, or my anger, or whatever. It just destroys the soul of a person. Okay, Therese was the opposite, She says, inside of us, there is this part, and nobody can touch it. And we are this precious before God, and this is what it means, and this is how you have to stay attuned to that. That's why she's a true doctor of the soul. She will show us really what health is. And it's also, very importantly, this is the key to understanding her spirituality and her little way. The little way, we often think the little way works this way. And it does, but it doesn't get to the depth of it, where you do little hidden things for God. Peeling potatoes is not but you do it, and I'm doing it for Jesus. And you're changing diapers for Jesus, and you're cleaning floors and doing little anonymous tasks, and that's Therese's little way. And so, that's the little way. Yes. That also works, and it's valid. This is her little way. When Therese was 13, I think I better get this right here. When she was 13. She had what she called her conversion experience. Okay? And her conversion experience was this, that not that she had ever acted out seriously, it was conversion in which she overcame her own hypersensitivity. Therese was a hypersensitive child to a point where after about grade 5 or 6, she couldn't go to school anymore. She was too sensitive. Playing with other kids bruised her, and she was crying and so on. She had all these hypersensitivities. And it culminated when she was 13 years old. And she describes this. She went to Christmas Eve midnight mass with her dad and a couple of her sisters, the ones who were not yet in the convent. And they come home, and she's walking slightly ahead of her father and her sister. And she overhears them talking. And they had this little ritual where the dad would have to hide a certain Christmas present for the little kids and so on. And her dad, she overhears her dad, whom she just worshipped, say to her sister, said, I hope we don't have to do this little charade again tonight for this kid, you know. And just hearing that from her own father froze her. And again, she went into a clinical depression. She lay in bed and almost died. And then she said it was a miracle. She said at a certain point, she said, Mary spoke to me, whether it was in a vision or whatever, and she said, I need some resiliency. And then she became a resilient soul after that, and a pretty strong, resilient soul. You know, which, for instance, when she went to the convent, she knew this was not going to be an easy ride. It's interesting. You know, when you study the literature of dark nights, they say a dark night of the soul, and this is going to hit Therese in two different places. We can talk about that afterwards, you know. They said a dark night of the soul will always hit you where you least expect it, and when you're least prepared for it, and where your ultimate Achilles heel is. So that it's not going to hit you where you know, we often try to prepare ourselves. I'm prepared for these crises. That's not the one that's going to knock you down. So this happened to Therese. She entered the convent at 15, and she's already got, we're going to come back on her conversion experience and resilience, and she's already a resilient young woman by this time. So she tries to prepare herself. She says, I know what's going to happen when I enter the convent. First of all, everybody in the whole world's going to say, you're not there for the right reason. You're there because your sisters are there, and you're trying to get into the convent to be with your sisters. She said, that's not why I'm going. I was going for Christ. She said, let people think what they think, you know. But then she knew the harsh conditions, the bad heating, the bad food, the hours, and so on. And cold was a real issue in those convents. Not an accident that many died of pneumonia and tuberculosis and so on. So she prepared herself for the harsh conditions, but she also prepared herself psychologically. She said, this is what's going to happen when I get there. Remember, this is Sophia. She said, half of the sisters are going to dote on me. This little cute little girl, it's wonderful. And the other half are just going to hate my guts, you know, because that's the way life works. Half of them, you know, and notice none of them are relating to her in any adult way, you know. So half of them, she's going to be their little pet, and the other half are going to say, why is this brat, spoiled kid in our convent? I hate her guts. So she's prepared. She's prepared for all of that. And she was prepared for everything except what happened. So what happened? She goes to the convent, and her father, who was God to her, and her father was a marvelous man, he gets Alzheimer's and goes crazy and takes a gun and chases policemen. They have to put him in an asylum, and she couldn't handle it. It just absolutely fractured her trust in life, her trust in God. It was a first powerful dark night. If her father can go crazy, maybe God can go crazy. Like later on, when she's actually dying in the months, she has the classical dark night in which, you know, she begins to wonder whether God exists, and she has the Mother Teresa kind of dark night. But her first real dark night was, you know, the disillusionment with her father, which led to a disillusionment with God. Okay. But anyway, after her conversion experience, and she writes it just as clearly as Sophia would write it, she said, after I overcame my hypersensitivity, she said, where I began to be able to move beyond a focus on myself. See, the danger with hypersensitivity is we're always, poor me. We're bleeding our own. Then you can start bleeding some other people's tears. Then what happened, said, I noticed this. said, I realized that I had been loved so preciously and that I was a very, very precious soul before God. Said, but I realized for most other people that wasn't the case at all. They were precious before God, but nobody had ever shown that to them. Says, and that the preciousness of their lives was being lost. And I want to read you this is at the heart of her, the little quote I have on the end there. She says, one Sunday, that's supposed to be not on, that's supposed to be one Sunday, looking at a picture of our Lord on the cross, I was struck by the blood flowing from his divine hands. I felt the pang of great sorrow when thinking this blood was falling to the ground without anyone hastening to gather it up. I resolved to remain in spirit at the foot of the cross and to receive its due. I don't want this precious blood to be lost. I shall spend my life gathering it up for the good of souls. To live from love is to dry your face. Now, this is a mystical metaphor, okay? She says, when Christ was dying, it's the most precious blood in the world was spilling on the ground and nobody was picking it up. That's true for millions of people. Our blood and our tears are going, nobody's noticing. She's saying, when I was a little girl, I cried tears and they noticed. God noticed, my family noticed, but I noticed around when it happens to other people, nobody notices. And the little way the essence is to notice the little. And it's to notice the tears of other people, to notice their pains and to begin to gather them up. See, that's the essence, that's the deep part of the little way. It means peeling potatoes and changing diapers and everything else. But this is the deep part. This is your central mystical metaphor, excuse me, and it's a powerful one. It's a very, very powerful metaphor. See, and notice it's based on, basically, when I was a little girl, when I cried tears, they noticed. Somebody dried them. They noticed how precious my life was, how, tears come out of pain. Blood drops when you're wounded. He said, my parents noticed, my sisters noticed, my aunts noticed, and God noticed. But with most people, nobody notices. So the essence of our spirituality is to notice the drops of blood that are flowing from other people's faces, which is the face of Christ, that are the tears that are flowing from me, and to gather them up. See, I'm trying to make other people's lives precious. And so the essence of our work is to show you how precious your life is. Your tears are being noticed. The small things in your life are important, which is exactly what abuse and indifference and callousness that we meet in life takes away from us. So she's the very opposite. Like reading St. Therese of Lisieux is the very opposite of what we normally meet in life. Indifference, callousness, cynicism, you're not that important, who do you think you are, and on and on. Your life isn't worth all that much. Okay, when we feel like that, pick up the story of a soul, and Therese will reattune you, she'll reattune you like the way a good musician tunes a piano. She'll reattune you to the preciousness of your own life. She was named the Doctor of the Soul, I think back about 1997. And the bishops voted, and they voted unanimously, that she be named the Doctor of the Soul. But there was quite a reaction to that, sometimes in the theological community and so on. They said, well, she wrote this one little book, and she was 24 years old and so on, but no, she's the Doctor of the Soul because I thought, bravo. You know why? Because doctors heal. Therese of Lisieux heals. There's a lot of theological literature, which is wonderful. It doesn't heal anything inside of you. Makes you a little smarter, gives you a few more insights, you have a few more little analytical tools in your toolbox, but it doesn't heal you at all. Therese of Lisieux will heal your soul. Now that's my input on her. And like I said, we walk into her through stages of kind of unconsciousness, but I want you to get to the last stage. So, we start with, this is Anne Frank, and she's this wonderful little girl, and so on. And tragically, sometimes we stop there. And we get all this cult about this beautiful little girl and so on, and all the piety, and she lost her mother, and she wrote this wonderful diary. That's all true. See, then you can walk a little further, and you can say, my God, this was one stunningly complex woman. She was Tinkerbell and Sophia and all that, and that's all wonderful. And you're getting closer to her essence. Then walk a little further and say, this is a person who can touch that previously touched part inside of me and always bring you back. She'll attune. That's why the story of a soul needs to be reread. Read it once, a couple years later, come back, read it again, and every time she'll massage that part. And after you walk, you will realize how precious you are before God, and how precious are your tears and your heartaches and everything that happens in your life, and that the little things are not unimportant. That's why it's called the little way. Every tear, every heartache, every loss, there's a meaning, and God's there, and somebody's picking up the blood and drying your face for you. She's a doctor of the soul. Thank you. I think Kathy's going to come up and give you a question, and somebody's going to come up and give you a question. Okay. Okay. And if Kathy doesn't do it, somebody's going to have to do it. Okay. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much. My mind is spinning. That's a very powerful ending to your talk there. We have a couple of questions that we'd just like to throw out that Father Ron has suggested. And if we could just spend a little bit of time talking amongst ourselves about those questions, then in about 15 minutes, we will have a chance for people to bring any questions or comments forward, and Father Ron can address them. So here are the two questions. What thing, I don't know how, now that I had the question beforehand, so now that I've heard the talk, I don't know what I would say. I have to think about this myself. What thing about St. Therese has intrigued you or drawn you? What thing did you hear today in particular that has intrigued you, somehow grasped, something touched that previously touched place inside of you? And the other question, the opposite is, what about St. Therese maybe has put you off or turned you off? Maybe in the past, or maybe something you heard today. So the two things we're going to talk about with each other is, what is the thing that has drawn us about her or intrigues us? And then what about her and her spirituality turns us off? Okay, so we're going to do that for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to bring questions forward to Father Ron. All right? All right, so Father Ron Rollheiser is here to answer your questions. Perhaps some of you have a comment you would like to make, or a question, or an insight you would like to share, or maybe that very special thing you were in particular intrigued with. So we have some people going around with a microphone. If you raise your hand, they will come over to you, and I'm going to turn this over to Father Ron.
Okay, so there are a couple of people with microphones. A microphone there, and we'll wait till you hear the microphone. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Father, for your presentation. There are a lot of versions of The Story of a Soul, huh? It's been edited in many ways recently. Can you say something about that?
Yes, there are a lot of versions, but in our days, there haven't been substantial differences. Today, it's more a difference where, thank God, and we're getting to a question of where the refinement of the translation. So the Carmelites they also do the work of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. But if you can find the translations of Rodriguez or Kavanaugh, but just the more recent translations, but the issues with substance were a little earlier. After she died, her sister was the editor. Now, I mean, her sister, was the abbess. She went through and corrected her spelling and redid the grammar, but then apparently sometimes they might cut this part out. You don't need to hear this or that. So that, but more recently, it's not so much that there's differences of manuscript. By manuscript, you mean substance. Now it's more just refining translation, so that, yeah. So that, I mean, I noticed the editions out here, they would be very trustworthy and they'd be very good. Okay. Other questions? It doesn't have to be your reactions. It can be anything to do with mysticism or Therese or... There's a question there.
In our group, we were talking about her humor, her wit, her jokes. Even on her deathbed, she was making jokes. Do you have any comments about her humor?
Okay. Well, I wish I could comment more on her humor. Partly, okay, again, you have to blame the censors, you know. See, today, and I think it's people like Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, some of these people who helped us come to a healthier sense of, you know, what is a saint. It's not that the old saints weren't healthy, but their censors weren't. Okay. And so that they tried to, and there was a genre, we call it hagiography, so that, you know, they would deliberately, like, leave out the colorful parts and so on, and sometimes they had to get them canonized, because Rome was also didn't like the color, you know. Even an example, like, people who know Dorothy Day, they said, till she died at age 84, she'd come out of the recreation room and light up a cigarette and say, somebody tell me a bad joke. You know, and Therese, there were, I mean, a little bit of that sneaks into the manuscript, but clearly, you know, they were guarding the manuscript, so it was much more just the more sacred parts. So we aren't really treated to her earthiness, but I'm sure it was there. I wish that we had more of it. You know, we are getting it with, you know, with Merton, with Dorothy Day, some of the more recent saints. In even with Mother Teresa, you know, apparently there was a pretty wicked little sense of humor underneath there. She could lay it out pretty good when she needed to, you know. In fact, I've read some of her writings, and when you get to the end, you say, she wrote this, you know. Remember that the piece, which is quite famous, Mother Teresa wrote about anyway, like, people are going to mistreat you, do it anyway, and so on. Other, okay, I'll take one on this side, and then...
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. I was just wondering, is there a new interest in Therese? I haven't heard that much about her lately.
Okay, is there a new interest in Therese? Yes. It started in 1997, which was the 100 years of her death. And so that, you know, the Carmelites promoted it. But there's never really been a waning of interest. It's interesting. She has always had a huge place in the popular Catholic mind, and the popular mind, period. And so that millions of people go to Lisieux every year. You know, and her writings remain popular. She's probably our most popular saint. That, I mean, today, in terms of the biggest following, the biggest number of and people who pray to her, and so on. And it's interesting, too, when you do. Now, there's the reason why you should go to the Basilica when you go to Lisieux. You know, to get saints canonized, they always have to prove 2 blue-chip, clear-cut miracles. Okay. And it's not easy, you know. You know, and then they're searching, and sometimes they wait 20 and 30 years and so on. Well, as you know, when Therese was dying, she said, I'm going to spend my eternity doing miracles and helping people on earth and so on. But if you go to the Basilica, the entire walls are plastered with bronze plaques of people claiming, like, thousands and thousands of miracles. So that it's not just one or the 2 to get her canonized. There's a little humor. A very close friend of mine is a Sulpician priest, and he's in his 70s, and he has a good sense of humor, and he says, and he went to Lourdes last year, and he says, I'm the only man who went to Lourdes and came back on crutches. Okay, so he didn't get a miracle, okay. 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 Yeah, this is like Oprah.
You know, the one thing that turns me off is I can never live up to this woman. And I've lived long enough to commit many, many sins, some pretty dark. And I, you know, oddly enough, that's the part of me that God uses when I'm with other people sometimes. It's just amazing how that happens. But I hate to think of myself having done those things. You know, and after you've been to confession 4 times, and they go, yeah, okay, that's enough. But you know that you've got that shadow side, and so, you know, and she wasn't married, didn't have kids yet.
Okay, very good. Let me, I'm glad you asked this because I want to say something about her. I meant to say and I forgot. You know, there is that danger when you read her, you say, well, you know, and what would she think if she knew my life and all this type of stuff? Well, it's an interesting incident. When she was still alive, and she was like 21, 22, 23, and the Carmelites, they would, French missionaries would go to Africa, Canada, or wherever, and they would take the names and they would pray for these priests, these missionaries, and they would write to them, the priest would write back, and then they have, you know, in fact, Doubleday published a book a couple of years ago of her correspondence with this one French priest who went to Africa, you know, and so he comes back for a home visit, and he wrote to her, and he says, I'm a little afraid to come and see you. And he said, oh, God, he said, you know, I struggle with things, and he said, you can probably guess what I'm struggling with, and she said, I'm not sure I'd feel very comfortable in your presence, you know. She wrote back a remarkable letter, said, if you think that, you don't know me. Said, then said, I'm disappointed my letters obviously didn't. Said, if you think that because you are struggling in your life or struggling with sex or struggling with whatever, that in some way this would put me off, said, then you don't know me. You've never known me. See, so that it's a wonderful line. See, powerful compassion, so that, but I can see what you say, and that's one of her great qualities. Her writings invite you to be better, but they don't judge you. You don't see a less refined writing will judge you, and that won't help you to become better. You know, see, and again, it gets back to her experience of unconditional love. See, unconditional love doesn't judge you. You know, obviously, when she was a little girl, when she was bad, her mom and dad still loved her. And so that's the kind of love she tries to, you know, you can be not perfect and it's not going to make any difference to me. You know, like she told this French priest, if you think that, you don't know me and you've obviously misunderstood my letters. But the other thing is she died before she had become a mother. Let me say something else here about her. She died at age 24, which at the time in France would have been the time you were ordained. And she was very conscious of that. Therese wanted to be a priest. She knew she never could and so on, but she was very conscious that when she was dying, that she said, if I were a man and living, this is when I'd be ordained. So she died before she could be a mother. She also died before she could be ordained. And I'm not just talking about what's happening inside the Roman Catholic Church right now, but she was conscious of that. She was very conscious that if I were a man and I weren't dying, this would be my ordination year. Interesting. Okay. Okay, microphones back there, and then we'll get.
Can you say a little bit about why she was named a patroness of missions, even though she didn't go anywhere?
Very good point. Why was she named patroness of missions, even though she didn't go anywhere? First of all, I like the paradox of that. You know, I like the paradox. You know, rather than the patroness of missions as somebody who's traveled the world 35 times. So they name a patroness of missions. I always like paradox. Somebody who never got more than 15 miles from home, other than this one little excursion to Rome with her dad. Incidentally, remember talking about her sense of humor, okay? In her diary, after she went to Rome, she said, Rome will test the faith stronger than mine. Okay. It wasn't, an unqualified joy, although she liked a lot of things about it, you know. Okay. Why was she named the Patron of Missions? Well, first of all, because it just happened. Let me give it to you phenomenologically, then we can try to interpret it. It began with, you know, the French missionaries. A lot of the French missionaries, it started with them having connections to the Carmelites and some of them writing to her and so on. But then after she died and so on, there was almost a cult about her, and the French missionaries France was sending out a lot of missionaries at the time, to Canada, to Africa, and so on. And these missionaries would put themselves under the patronage of Therese. You know, she's at home, and she was home praying, and we're going out to, and then it became a devotional, it became almost like an institutionalized devotion to her. And at the time, for instance, the entire part of northern Canada, which where I'm from, you know, all of northern Canada was Christianized by missionaries from France, oblates. Gotta work that in. Okay. And they all had this powerful devotion to Therese. And they had missionaries in Africa and Asia and so on, Vietnam and Laos and so on. And they were all under her patronage. And they would write to their bishops and say, like, you know, like, you should name her Patroness of Missions. And eventually the bishops went to Rome and they did it. And so, I mean, that's just the way it happened. I believe these things, when great paradox happen, they happen for a reason. I think it's also meant to teach us something, that you don't have to be around the world to be truly in the world. You know, I know a hermit, Trappist, outside of Portland, who's my spiritual director. He's a wonderful man. And he said, you know, I was a diocesan priest, and I tried my best, and I wasn't connected. He said, then I became a Trappist, and he said, and I was better, but he said I still wasn't fully connected. So now he's still a Trappist, but he lives in a hermitage, and he's the way Merton did for a while, and he says, now, he said, I feel the pulse of this planet. He said, no, every night when you're sleeping, I'm praying for you. I'm there. See, that powerful thing where somebody who doesn't leave a hut, other than to go now, and as he's getting older, he's returning more to the monastery and so on, but that they are connected to your heart, that, you know, inside the body of Christ, the travel and the connection is mystical rather than through airplanes and so on. And so I find it a wonderful paradox and a wonderful challenge to us. You know, our hearts are restless. We want to be all over the planet. And Therese would say, go very deeply to one place inside of your heart, and you'll be all over the planet. She actually had hoped to become a missionary to China. It was either China or Vietnam. And so the morning she coughed up blood, you know, and she realized I got tuberculosis. In those days, you're going to die from it, okay? Her biggest sorrow was, now I'm never going to get to go to China. And then the idea is, I got to bring China here. I've got to connect from here. But wonderful question. Microphones, there's back there. And then if you want to come up front here, then he'll go next, okay? Just.
When you were talking of the spirituality of Saint Therese, something that I think you might not have brought out, at least sufficiently to satisfy me, is when it was called the Little Way, Therese's spirituality was a complete break from the 19th century, and even previous to the 19th century, 17th, 18th, 19th spirituality that was common in the church. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you know, I didn't want to give the impression that the Little Way wasn't a good designation and so on, but I did want to highlight that the deeper internal part there. So it's not so much the scrubbing of the floors or the anonymousness, it's more the gathering the unnoticed drops of tears and blood and so on. Yeah, the Little Way, as a contrast to spiritualities then, the same as a contrast to spiritualities now. Invariably, all of us, we have an itch to do the big thing, you know, to make the big splash, to you know, somehow have a world impact that you can see, okay? And see, so spirituality has always been tempted, and at her time was too much giving, and the same as in our own age. It's still, we always have the temptation of, you know, to the big splash, the big thing that somehow you get on the cover of Time magazine, or somehow you write the bestseller, or somehow, you know, or you get the large persona, you know, like there's been some very, very good people in our time, Mother Teresa, Jean Vanier, people like that, even Henry Nouwen, who had a very, very large persona, you know, and you know, their books and their influence goes around the world, or Thomas Merton and so on, Dorothy Day, and see, we'd always want that, and even though those people are about the little way, we envy their big way. I remember once preaching in a church in Edmonton, and I was preaching the Martha Mary text, and I used as an example, you know, commenting on that, Mother Teresa, Henry Nouwen, and Jean Vanier. That should be a safe set of sources. Well, it wasn't. I'm at the church door afterwards. You know how everybody tells you, Father, you preached well even when you didn't, and so on. And I got a nice homily, Father, but, he said, can I ask you something? Okay, but, can I ask you something? He says, have you ever wondered, like with Mother Teresa, Jean Vanier, Henry Nouwen, how they say, you know, you don't have to achieve anything, how they're all great achievers, you know? Mother Teresa stepping off the plane in Stockholm with the Nobel Peace Prize, you don't really have to do anything, you know? Henry Nouwen wrote 60 books, and he was being pursued by Harvard, Yale, and Notre Dame. They all wanted to come and teach at his own conditions, and he's trying to hide away from them. He says, you don't really have to achieve anything, you know? He said, it kind of rings empty to me. He said, how do you have a sense of a self-image when you're a big fat nobody? Oh, he's right, you know. But see, so there is that propensity inside of us to, you know, I got to somehow register with a bigger splash, you know. And then sometimes that creeps into, and it did at the time of Therese, into spirituality in terms of that it invites you away from the quiet anonymousness, the little task, you know, to be the superior rather than the lay sister, and so on. And so Therese's spirituality was a very, very powerful corrective, you know, among other things, to say no. Spirituality, and again, it's consistent with everything else I've said. It's about the heart and what's precious, and nobody has to see it. So that's part of the little way. I wanted to emphasize, though, I'm getting very defensive here, you know, no, just that, but to ground the little way on that mystical image, which I think is so powerful and beautiful done. That just that kind of, I noticed that, and remember her official title was Therese of the face of Christ. See that, so that the whole thing about Christ's face, but the drops of blood and so on, that became so important and central to her. Question here?
What really fascinates me is that leap from the ambition to be all things, and yet to trust enough to say that if I'm going to realize any of this, God's going to have to do it. I wondered if you would want to comment on that trust and that simplicity.
Yeah, you know, the reason I'm finding it difficult to do it is because it's so omnipresent in her that it's almost like a leitmotif in her work. So that for her, and you see that in all the great saints and mystics and so on, in our own time. For instance, Mother Teresa would always say, nothing I'm doing is me, you know, nothing, it's all God, you know. See, so the half of it is the admission, to say, like, this is not me. But the other half is to have enough trust to do it. See, one of the reasons why, and it ties to his question, one of the reasons why we struggle to accept the hidden way is because we don't trust that God is going to give us significance. See, we have an unconscious, remember this expression, this cliche saying, we unconsciously want to make ourselves immortal. So how do we do it? Have a child, plant a tree, write a book. You know, remember this? You know, see, notice you plant a tree, you have a child, write a book. You're leaving something behind, so you can't just disappear. See, we're giving ourselves our own immortality. So achieve something. Except in our world, is it win an Academy Award, win a Super Bowl, do this, you know, somehow, you know, achieve something that leaves a mark, and then we have immortality. And in fact, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. We're hardwired for that. We're hardwired, for instance, to produce kids. And if you don't do it, your biology and your psyche is going to tell you. And it's going to say, you know, like, who do you think you are that you can just buck nature, you know? See, so we are hardwired to get ourselves into the gene pool. But not just in terms of kids, in terms of, we want to make ourselves immortal. And so it's hard to trust that God's going to do it for us. Now, if you were Protestants here, I could switch terminology and you get that immediately. That's the famous Protestant thing on justification and Paul. See, and where Paul says we're trying to boast. He doesn't mean we're trying to brag. For Paul, boasting means precisely, I'm trying to somehow leave a mark because I don't trust God will leave it for me. And so I'm trying to achieve something. Plant a tree, write a book, have a child, win a Super Bowl, do something, get my name engraved on the Stanley Cup, give something, you know. And then, you know, that I'm going to leave a mark. See, so it's hard to trust anonymously. My life doesn't have to go anywhere. Nobody has to even know I exist, you know. God knows it. You know, you have this beautiful text in the Gospels where when Jesus sends the apostles out the first time, the disciples, this is more than the 12, in pairs, and they go to these towns, and they come back, and Mark says apparently this went pretty well. They came back, and they were full of everything, the Spirit, themselves, everything. And they said, we cast out demons, we healed people, we did all this stuff, and so on. And Jesus said, it's wonderful. He said, but don't rejoice in that. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven. See, God has you firmly locked on God's radar screen, and it doesn't matter whether you've ever cast out a demon. And it doesn't matter whether you've ever had a child or written a book or won a Super Bowl. Your names are written in heaven, you know. I'm sure he told the New York Giants after won the Super Bowl, this is wonderful, but don't rejoice in it. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven, not on the Super Bowl trophy, you know. You know, because unconsciously, let me insert a little humor here. You know what our unconscious fear is? Unconsciously, we fear that God isn't going to give us our immortality, even in this life, in this sense. This is our unconscious fear. Have you ever had this happen to you? You go to your closet, and you're looking for an item of clothing, a blouse, a sweater, or whatever, and while you're looking for it, you find another item that you completely forgot you had. You say, yeah, remember I had this pair of slacks, you know. Well, we're scared that one day God's going to look down and say, my God, she's still alive, you know. He's looking for somebody else, but he sees you, you know. Okay. You know, and Jesus says, you know, remember that beautiful text where he says, don't be anxious, don't be anxious. He says, no sparrow falls from the sky, no hair falls from a person, except God notices. There's no radar gaps on God's radar screen. And see, that's ultimately what trust is. People like trust, they trust it. I don't have to go to the ends of the world. God is going to take me there, you know. I can trust, and God will do it for me. That is my biggest struggle. I'm sure it's the biggest struggle for most of us, in terms of we don't quite trust it. We don't quite trust it. I'll give you another little humor. Remember the baseball player Reggie Jackson? And I liked Reggie because Reggie was so colorful, and you know, and he'd always play the egotist the way Dean Martin played the drunk. And one day Reggie said, it's really hard being Reggie Jackson. He said, because I've got to deal with the magnitude of me. Okay. What I like about that is we're always dealing with the opposite. We're dealing with the insubstantiality of me. Who am I? And will I simply disappear? And who loves me? And where will I leave a mark? So it becomes hard to trust. And see, again, Therese, she knew she was loved. She knew she was valued. She knew she was locked into. She says, having been loved so wonderfully, humanly, I knew that God loved me in this way. So she could trust. But trust is the big piece. We'll do one more, and then I don't want to keep you from lunch. Okay. Okay, you've been waiting. Let him do, and we'll do one brief question, and then it's lunchtime.
Yes, my question is directly related in the area of what you were just talking about. I noticed in reading her diary that she said that most of the time she experienced deep aridity and dryness in her day-to-day life.
Yeah.
However, we know she had extraordinary experiences from time to time, which set the course of her life moving, or seemed to be a reflection of that. And I noticed that some saints have a very, like Saint Teresa of Avila, Teresa of Calcutta,
Yeah.
claims that after her
Yeah.
death. Why is it that some saints seem to reach a place that seems to be uplifted by God more often, and they're centered closer to that relationship with God, where you have saints like this who aren't, but both are extraordinary at the same time? I was just wondering, I asked you kind of two questions, but I
Okay,
wanted to comment about the interior life.
I'll tell you what. That's actually a very important question, but it's a huge question, and I'd like to come back on that this afternoon. Maybe I
Okay.
can talk about that a little with Ruth Burroughs, but that's a very, very important question. Like, why do, for instance, Mother Teresa, why did she have a 60-year dark night? And you'll see at the end of her life, that happened to Therese of Lisieux, you know, that, and it's interesting. There's a new book out by a man called Halik is his last name. Thomas Halik. He's a Czech writer. His books are now in English. And he has a book called, okay, what is it called? I'll look it up. But in there he has a chapter on Therese of Lisieux's Dark Night of the Soul. And he says, it's very interesting, he points out something that other commentators haven't pointed out. When she went through her Dark Night of the Soul, you know, where at a certain point she feels like an atheist, she then deliberately took this as, this is going to be my solidarity with atheists. And from now on, I want them to approach God through my dryness and so on. And she made this, she used that as an occasion to be in solidarity with atheism. And she mentioned Nietzsche and said, and then she realized that she had judged these people too harshly before. And now she wanted to die in deep empathy with atheists.
Teresa of Lisieux.
Teresa of Lisieux, okay. And then, and we'll come back on this afternoon. It seems on her deathbed, just as she died, and she died in dryness, but just as she died, she had what the Carmelites of John the Cross will call a living flame experience, so that her ecstasy and the breakthrough of God ecstatically was the last seconds of her life. But sometimes people die and that doesn't happen to them. Great Christians die and they don't have the ecstasy, and they die in complete dryness and so on. But we'll look at that. It's a very, very important question. But it's 12 o'clock, and Kathy, do you need to give instructions? Okay.
So there is lunch available on both sides of this room. And we'll be back here at 1 o'clock for centering prayer, and then the rest of the presentation and more questions. All right? So see you at 1.